All right, guys, so we've moved on to chapter 3, which is the early African societies. Specifically, we're going to be looking at Egypt, but this will also touch on Nubia, or the Kush kingdom, which was to its south. So as always, let's start off with a little bit of geography. Settlement in northern Africa before the year 5000 BCE. By the way, BCE means before the Common Era, or before the year 0. Usually they say BC. And AP, they like to say BCE because it's non-Christian related. So just to give you a heads up, when we say BCE, we mean before the year 0. So in northern Africa, before the year 5000 BCE, there were many agricultural villages spread across northern Africa. And that's because northern Africa was not like it is today. Today, this is all the Sahara Desert. However, prior to 5000 BCE, this was all very good pastoral land. It was grasslands. You could do very small-scale agriculture throughout this area. But as you guys read about, in around the year 5000 BCE, all of this changed. There was a big climate shift that occurred after the last ice age. And with that climate shift, the area in northern Africa, where many people were doing some small-scale farming, became the Sahara Desert, the largest desert in the entire world. And so obviously because of that, the people who were doing small-scale farming and had these small agricultural villages, they had to leave. You cannot grow stuff in a desert, just in case you didn't know that. So they started to migrate towards the Nile River. Some migrated south, obviously, to other areas that were fertile. But many people in this territory ended up moving towards the Nile River, which was one of the few remaining water sources in northern Africa. The Nile River, what it's known for is it's the longest river in the entire world, and also it's one of the few rivers in the world that actually flows north. It starts down here in Lake Victoria. You can see it's almost, it's a little bit more than halfway down the African continent. This is modern-day Uganda. And so this is at a higher elevation, and then it ends up flowing north because the elevation decreases. So it's kind of like at an elevated, not quite a mountain here. And then as it goes from Uganda all the way to the Mediterranean, the elevation lowers and lowers, and the gravity takes it that direction. It annually flooded in the northern section of the Nile, so it was very good soil all along here, but especially here is where they end up getting a lot of the flooding. And that's because a lot of the gravity of the river started to push harder at this point, and therefore it all kind of bottleneck in the river, and then the water would overflow. The good thing about it is that this deposited a whole lot of really good fertile soil along the banks for really good agriculture. And it was good agriculture along the entire Nile, but especially in this northern region in Egypt, right by the Mediterranean. We call this the Delta, and this is where all the really good flooding and agriculture occurred. All right, so the very first agricultural settlements in this area are roughly around the time of that climate change, about the year 5200 BCE. This is when we have the first settlements in the northern Egyptian area. Like I said, it's by this northern delta, by the Mediterranean. You can see here it kind of splits off the Nile River. And with all this area and all the flooding that occurs, this is really the ideal location for agriculture in northern Africa. So with all the migrants that are moving in there because of the climate change, we end up getting a whole lot of new crops as well as other resources brought into the territory. From many of the migrants moving into this area, they bring crops like squashes and that sort of thing. But the most important thing that the migrants bring in to this area from the Sahara Desert region are the beasts of burden. The beasts of burden being things like cattle, for the first time are now reaching this area in Lower Egypt. But also because of its location so close to Mesopotamia, which is going to be over here, they are also getting wheat and barley. Wheat and barley are not necessarily native to Egypt, but because they're at a similar latitude as Mesopotamia, they are able to grow and prosper in the same area. So because of all this really good agriculture, the population starts to slowly grow, And the settlements end up moving from this northern area by the delta and end up moving south and south and south and eventually a little bit farther east and west off of the river. Something about Egypt as well, which is interesting and unique in comparison to Mesopotamia, is that Egypt has some natural barriers that keep outsiders away for many, many centuries, actually several thousand years. Remember, Mesopotamia was kind of this wide open space. It was a crossroads. So it was very easy to come, invade, take over. Egypt was a little different. It's in a good location for trade. It's right in the Mediterranean, and so because of that, they have constant contact with other people in the Mediterranean basin, as well as Mesopotamia. It's very easy to go from the Mediterranean through the Nile River and then trade with the agricultural settlements along Egypt. But the thing is, you have these two deserts on either side of the Nile River. You have the Western Desert and the Eastern Desert. I know they're not very creative names, but that's what they're called. And the good thing about these deserts is that it's easy to keep people out. Because especially this Western Desert here, remember, is part of the Sahara Desert. People are not coming through the Sahara Desert to get to you. That's too hard. They're going to go south and conquer some people down here instead. Also, if outsiders wanted to come in, it's very difficult at this point to bring large military forces through the Mediterranean on boats and then up the Nile River. Again, that's just too much effort. So because of that, Egypt is not isolated, but they are free from the attacks of outside groups that want to come in and conquer for their resources. So they're at a geographical advantage in comparison to Mesopotamia. All right, some other differences between Egypt and Mesopotamia are in their development. So Egypt did not experience as many invasions and outside threats, but also Egypt did not develop the city-states, and they had less walled-in cities, and that's because of this fact that they had these natural barriers. The walled-in cities were primarily for protection from the outsiders, so because they had these natural barriers, it wasn't a necessity. So instead, we don't have as many people grouping together for protection. We still have cities popping up, but just not the density or the number that we have in Mesopotamia. Also, because the Nile River is so incredibly long, remember it's the longest river in the entire world, there's not as much of a need for people to gather in one particular place by the river to develop an agricultural center or a city. Instead, we have smaller villages that are just kind of dotting up and down the Nile River. So a big similarity, though, is just like in early Mesopotamia during the Sumerian times, we do have these developments of these small kingdoms with theocratic rulers. So that is a similarity that does exist. But like I said, Egypt just never develops these big city-states like Mesopotamia. And a lot of that had to do with its geography and its lack of a threat from outside invaders. All right, so like I was saying, it was a whole bunch of little regional kingdoms, and that all stopped in about the year 3100 BCE. There was a really strong southern Egyptian military leader. He wasn't a king. A lot of times you hear he was a king, but he wasn't. He was just kind of a high-ranking official in the military, and his name was Menes. He is from southern Egypt, which is down in this area. We call it Upper Egypt because remember the Nile flows north. So this is upriver in the south, and this is the lower part of the river in the north. So Menes is here in the southern part. He's a high-ranking military official. And more than likely, during this time, there's probably some environmental issues in the south. It's not as fertile as in the north, so they probably had some drought or had a few bad years of agriculture that was putting pressures on society, things like famine, starvation. So more than likely, because of those pressures, he brought his military into the north and ended up conquering the northern part of Egypt, called Lower Egypt. Because remember, this is the really super fertile area with all the flooding. So with this, he unifies all of the kingdoms along the Nile River in the north, the upper part of Egypt as well as the lower part of Egypt. And he establishes himself as the very first pharaoh. His crown that he establishes in this